Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the King of Judah, Part A. Introductory Chapters. Chapter 4. When was the biblical historiography written? Which sources did it rely on? Which ideas guided its writing? In modern biblical research, there are two main hypotheses regarding the time of composition of the Deuteronomistic historical description of the history of Israel. Most scholars, especially in Europe, believe it was written after the destruction of the First Temple, starting in the exilic period and continuing all the way during the post-exilic times and beyond, as a composition intended to describe the history of the people of Israel from Horeb, the Deuteronomistic Mount Sinai, until the exilic period and explain the reality of life under exile. An important literary tool used by the authors of this historical description is the idea of prophecy and its fulfillment. Prophecies about the future were placed at historical focal points and were intended to explain the historical process and give it a meaning. The fulfillment of the prophecies at a later date testified to God's control over history, explained the causality behind each of the decisive events in the nation's history, explains also the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and leads to inevitable conclusion that this traumatic event is the fulfillment of the prophecies that threatened destruction if the people didn't stop sinning. A main claim of these scholars is that the description in the second book of Kings, chapter 22-23, about the finding of the book and Josiah's cultic reform is unreliable and not reflecting the actual history. They claim that the Deuteronomistic law is a utopian law that was never actually implemented during the First Temple period, while in the Persian period, the one temple and the concentration of the cult in Jerusalem were already an existing reality. According to these researchers, the historiographical composition continued to develop during the Persian period, that is, during the days of the return of exiles from Babylon to Jerusalem, when various additions and new ideological layers were added to the text, and it underwent various edits through which it was adapted to new audiences and to the reality that continued to develop over centuries. On the other hand, a minority of researchers, mainly in the USA and Israel, theorized that the Deuteronomistic historiographical descriptions were first put in writing towards the end of the First Temple period, likely during the days of King Josiah, and continued to be edited and written during the exilic and post-exilic periods. According to this approach, which I also support, two main stages of development are evident within the biblical historiography. The first Deuteronomist was active during the days of King Josiah. The main ideological message that are expressed within the early Deuteronomistic work, we call it DTR1, the first Deuteronomist, reflect the reality of that period. These messages seek to explain how it came about that the kingdom of Israel, the largest and most powerful kingdom in the hill country, which for 200 years dominated the entire area and even ruled over the small kingdom of Judah, in one way or another was destroyed, many of its inhabitants were deported, and it became an Assyrian province. Why did this happen? Furthermore, and even more importantly, how did the small kingdom of Judah, which always lived in the shadow of its neighbor to the north, survive the Assyrian occupation and remain in existence? My conclusion is that The first and main message of this early Deuteronomistic work is its explanation of the historical reality of the days of Josiah, and through it also the unambiguous ideological, political, religious, cultic message relating how the inhabitants of the kingdom of Judah must behave so that their good fortune continues and they don't find themselves in the same situation as their neighbor to the north. Against a backdrop of fateful and significant events, such as the destruction of the kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE and Sennacherib's campaign in 701 BCE, an understanding developed in Judah of the explanation for the historical reality of the last 100 years of the nation's history. Namely, the kingdom of Israel was destroyed and its inhabitants were deported because of the continuous sin of all the kings of Israel who followed the path of Jeroboam, the first king in Israel, and his sins, and continued to worship to the God of Israel in Dan and Bethel, temple that existed throughout the days of the kingdom, and according to the book of Kings, were built by Jeroboam, the first king who reigned in Israel, without the kings of Israel realizing that these were illegitimate places of worship. Therefore, they were punished by God, who brought a final destruction over the kingdom and exiled the people of Israel. Each of the kings of Israel was evaluated negatively using a uniform theological formula that states, for example, in First Book of Kings, chapter 15, verse 34. He did what was evil in the sight of God and walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin by which he made Israel to sin. End of quote. On the other hand, according to the Deuteronomistic ideology, the Judahite worship of God took place where Yahweh chose to have his temple in Jerusalem. Therefore, Judah was not punished like the kingdom of Israel and continued to exist. In other words, the authors who wrote this description not only knew about the destruction of the kingdom of Israel, but also knew the main basics of Deuteronomic law. This knowledge revealed that they acted after the destruction of the kingdom of Israel, between the days of Hezekiah and Josiah, most likely during the days of King Josiah. During this period, the Assyrian Empire withdrew from all its holdings in the Levant. Judah was granted a short period of freedom from imperial rule, and it is possible that against the background of this relatively optimism, Josiah could have carried out a cultic reform, and the Deuteronomistic school might have taken advantage of this period to try to cement its ideology within the kingdom. Moreover, from the historical description, one can learn that not only did God choose Jerusalem as the site for his temple, but he also made an eternal promise to the city he chose and the temple that was built there for him. This promise was designed to protect his followers from anyone who would rise against them. A similar eternal promise exists for the dynasty of the house of David, which maintained its loyalty to God. Within the early Deuteronomistic work, DTR1, God's threefold promise of eternity to his temple, to the city, and to the Jerusalemite dynasty of kings is the idea that balances between the sins of the northern kingdom and its destruction and the continued existence of Judah. This same promise is also the main message in the composition. Jerusalem is the eternal capital chosen by God, so that his temple may exist there forever, and so that the house of David will continue to rule from it. The entire early story is meant to serve this idea. the many repetitions of the expected destruction of the kingdom of Israel due to the sins of Jeroboam, the use of the prophecy and its fulfillment as a literary motive, and the repeated speeches reiterating the eternal promise are the central elements in the early Deuteronomistic work, DTR1. History, as it was known in Judah towards the end of the 7th century BCE, testified to God's promise of eternity to the house of David, the capital in Jerusalem, and to the temple of Yahweh. The destruction of Israel in 722 BCE and Sennacherib's campaign shortly thereafter, 701 BCE, during which, despite terrible results in much of the kingdom of Judah, Jerusalem was spared and not conquered, while the house of David remained in power and the temple only continued to consolidate its position in Judah, only perpetuated and strengthened this idea. However, shortly after the writing of the Deuteronomistic historiographical composition was finished, it had become the most central and important composition in the kingdom of Judah, one that describes the past and defines present reality. Destruction came upon Jerusalem, and the Jerusalemite elite found themselves exiled in Babylon, cut off from the lost city, from the burnt temple, and from most of the people who remained in their land in Judah. This was the first time that the Judean elite was cut off from its land and from the people it had ruled, the first time that the eternal capital stood desolate with the house of David in exile. But no less central was the ideological and religious rift. Alongside the need to explain the destruction and exile was the need to re-explain history. The early Deuteronomistic composition was now neither relevant nor topical. It was not topical because the history described in it ended during the days of Josiah, about 40 years before the destruction and exile where people are now. What is the point of historical essay that talks about the distant past of an optimistic kingdom that lived in its own land, and how pertinent can it be to the public that lived over 2 generations later in exile in Babylon? Moreover, this composition was no longer relevant because at its core was the promise of eternity to the temple, to the capital, and to the dynasty. And here was the temple burned, the city destroyed, and the dynasty of the house of David in exile. It would have been possible to give up. To give up the book, the historical memory, and even the faith in the God who had made promises of eternity, following the path of many people, nations, who were forced into submission by larger empires, the land conquered, and large parts of the people were deported. The path from renouncing the historical memory and belief to a national dissolution and full disappearance from history is short and fast. However, in contrast to the fate of many peoples, many nations from that period, various processes, some of which can be verified, led these particular exiles to undertake a rapid process of adapting their lifestyles, ideology, religion, and even cult to life in exile as Judahites. So too was the Deuteronomistic composition quickly adjusted. In order to make it topical, concluding chapters were added to it, which completed the historical description that ended in the days of Josiah, and added to it a description of the reigns of his successor, the last 4 kings of Judah, and the history of the land up to the brief description of the temple destructions, the conquest of Jerusalem, and the deportation of the people. In order to make the description relevant for the member of the exiled generation, This description underwent intensive editing and ideological adjustment. The description of Manasseh's days was stripped of any historical content, leaving only the direct accusation asserting that the destruction came because of his sins. And now we have explanation for the destruction of Jerusalem. In addition to this, wherever in the early description the eternal promise was found relating to the temple, to Jerusalem, and to the house of David, conditional sentences were added stating that the eternal promise would only be fulfilled if the people walk in the way of God and obey his commandments. Moreover, warnings were added claiming that if the people do not walk in the way of God and obey his commandments, then God will bring destruction and exile upon them. The edited texts created an image according to which Judah was also in a steady process of descent towards the destruction. In the speeches in which conditions were added to the eternal promise, there was now also a message that foresaw the destruction that would also come upon Judah, including a call for repentance and a return to faith during the days of exile. To a large extent, all these ideological changes reflected an adoption of position that prevailed in Jerusalem even before the destruction, and which were expressed by circles outside the main Jerusalem current that composed the early Deuteronomistic historiographical work. The most prominent speaker of this movement known to us was the prophet Jeremiah, who in his prophecies and words expressed ideas that were later adopted by the members of the exiled generation who edited, wrote, and created the later Deuteronomistic composition. We call it DTR2, the second Deuteronomist, in light and in the spirit of these ideas. Jeremiah also knew the ideas of God's eternal promise and the concept of the temple working as a kind of insurance policy. But even before the destruction, he understood that the insurance was conditional, dependent on the behavior of the people and on the leadership built on wise and sane politics. He called on the people to improve their own actions and not to rebel against Babylon, so that the eternal promise could be realized, and not to trust that it is an unconditional promise. In Jeremiah 7, verse 2 to 15, for example, the prophet is commanded to stand at the gate of the temple, and his words are described to all you men of Judah who enter these gates to worship Yahweh. He says to them, how conditional is the eternal promise of God? And I'm quoting, amend your ways and your doings, and I will let you dwell in this place. Do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh. End of quote. It means don't think that this is an unconditional insurance. The prophet explicitly ties the eternal promise to the actions of the people and say, quoting, for if you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly execute justice one with another, if you do not oppress the alien, the fatherless, or the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after other gods to your own heart, then I will let you dwell in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your fathers forever. Jeremiah explicitly comes out against those who think that the eternal promise will protect them unconditionally. And I'm quoting again, behold, you trust in deceptive words to not avail. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, burn incense to Baal, and go after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and said, we are delivered, only to go on doing all these abominations? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of thieves in your eyes? Behold, I myself have seen it, says Yahweh. Jeremiah compares the future fate of the temple to the fate of the temple in Shiloh. And I'm quoting again, go now to my place that was in Shiloh, where I made my name dwell at first, and see what I did to it for the wickedness of my people Israel. And now, because you have done all these things, said Yahweh, and when I spoke to you persistently, you didn't listen. And when I called you, you didn't answer. Therefore, I will do to this house, which I called by my name, and in which you trust, and to the place which I gave to you and to your fathers, as I did to Shiloh. And I will cast you out of my sight, as I cast out all your kinsmen, all the offsprings of Ephraim. End of quote. In one of the last chapters of this podcast, we will discuss the untold story of Jeremiah and his family and their connections with Shiloh, the temple there, and to the family of Eli. This is an interesting story. But notably, the Deuteronomistic text and the biblical historiography didn't stop in this point. After imitating this new idea of the DTR2, they continued to develop during the exilic period and even more so during the post-exilic period. However, during this period, the writers who wrote the literary works and the audience for whom these literary works were intended were already living in a different ideological, religious, and cultic world, which had other matters to emphasize and other messages to convey. These messages were also inserted into the early historiographic work, thus expanding the Deuteronomistic work that tells the story from Joshua to Kings, adding many changes which adapted the writing to the new audience and the emerging history. As part of all the literary work of the post-exilic period, when Judah was under the rule of the Persian Empire and some of the exiled Jerusalemite elite came back to Jerusalem, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah was written, probably towards the end of the Persian period at the beginning of the 4th century BCE. The book was compiled by priestly circles in Jerusalem. It expresses the ideology of the exilic community who had returned to their land and asserts their ownership and right to the land. This community was connected to those exiled in Babylon and described everything that happened in Judah since the destruction of the first temple, the end of the Deuteronomistic composition, as being initiated, financed, and implemented by the exiled community and the representatives they sent to Judah. The book written at this stage included the creation of the myth of the ruined Jerusalem, the myth of the empty land that was then, and the myth of the mass return. We came back, we the returnees. All the while connecting linguistically, conceptually, and historically to the end of the Book of Kings, and continuing on from it as if 2 generations had not passed between the time of the temple's destruction and the time of the return to Zion. At the core of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah is the story of 2 generations in the history of the return to Zion. The story of the first generation that came to Judah immediately after the Edict of Cyrus and renewed the worship, 539, 538 BCE, and the generation later also founded the temple, the second temple that was built in Jerusalem, 516 BCE. And then the story jumps to the 4th generation, to the return to Zion about 70 years later, in the middle of the 5th century BCE. The later story mainly includes the event of Nehemiah's life and centers on the building of Jerusalem's wall and the consolidation of the status of Jerusalem, as well as the fateful repopulation of 1/10 of the inhabitants of the province. This was the period when also the Pentateuch was also created. The Deuteronomistic work neither knew of nor recognized descriptions of the primeval history, ancestral stories, and the story of the Exodus from Egypt. There are hints, especially in the northern prophets, such as Amos and Hosea, that some knew different traditions about the Exodus from Egypt and the ancient fathers of Israel, the ancient father Jacob, who is Israel. Scholars now accept that the ancestral stories and the story of the Exodus originally consisted of two separate historical stories which developed independently for a long time until they were combined literally during the creation of the Pentateuch. During the Persian period, the connection between the primeval history, the ancestral stories, and the story of Exodus, alongside the introduction of the long historical sequence about the tale of the people of Israel from the creation of the world to the conquest of the land, was introduced by priestly writing. Apparently, over the course of many years, a sequence of individual stories was reconfigured and edited and then integrated into a sequence of other stories without becoming part of a comprehensive processing and editing of the entire Torah, an undertaking that only happened much later. There are many parallels between the development processes of the Pentateuch and the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, the process that underwent between the two books. Many scholars agree that the two collections of works were mostly written and edited in the Persian period by small circles of priests. Both express the set of ideas prevalent among these priests and the processes of development and changes that they underwent throughout this period are evident. Both compositions made use of written sources that were available to them, as well as oral traditions. They edited these sources and added to them, and in both texts, Jerusalem, the temple, the cult, and the law of the Torah lie at the center of the composition, alongside an emphasis on the right of the Zion returnees, people who came back from Babylon to the land. The relationship between these returnees and other groups who lived in the region during the same period, the status of Jerusalem as the only place of worship for the God of Israel, and the place of the priests and the Levites among the people. For our purpose, in this book, in terms of the dealing with the history of the people of Israel, it does not matter so much when exactly the historical description was written. In any case, it is clear that the descriptions of most of Israel's history were written hundreds of years after the conquest attributed to Joshua, the united monarchy of the days of David and Solomon, the monarchy's eventual division into two kingdoms, and the histories of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The stories were committed to writing quite far in time from the ancient reality. They rely on written and oral sources, and they quite doubtfully reflect the history as it was. The main question to be asked are, at what point can the biblical description begin to be regarded as historically reliable? Related to this is the crucial question of the sources the authors relied on. For if late authors had reliable sources, then even if the historical description was put together at a late stage, we might assume that it preserved authentic memories. In this context, the study of the development of writing in Israel and Judah is of great importance. We will not deal with this question here, but most researchers accept the assumption that, at least regarding the early periods of Israel's history, even if written sources existed, most stories have been preserved orally for a long time. Such traditions are very problematic in terms of their historical reliability. We know that historical stories underwent many changes during their transmission processes. both during the oral transmission process and when they were written down. Stories were written out of historiographical necessity and as part of the wider ideological trends, and thus were probably manipulated to fit the writer's own purpose. In his book, The Past That Shapes the Present, my teacher Nadav Ne'eman writes, and I'm quoting, many researchers today doubt whether there ever existed a large collection of ancient stories, first handed down by oral tradition and then written down and integrated into biblical history. Furthermore, even if the story that was put down in writing was based on oral tradition, the writing stage brought about a profound change in the story. It turns out that the tradition served as nothing more than a nucleus around which the later author wove his written work. It is even possible, continued Nadav Ne'eman, that significant parts of the prose in the Bible do not lean at all on ancient traditions, but are fictional literary works or works constructed around tiny kernels of reality. This lends credence to the assumption that works written in prose reflect firstly the time of their writing and the worldview and trends of the later authors, and only marginally, if at all, the time to which they are attributed. End of quote. This means that biblical literature in general and the historiographical description in particular was not intended to reflect history in terms of absolute historical truth, within which every detail must be accepted. It was intended from the outset to serve political, ideological, religious, cultic, and economic trends. Moreover, given the changes in these trends throughout the different periods and places where this literature was created and the new masters it was meant to serve over time, so the historical descriptions also changed within the limits that these changes could take place. What was known to the general public at that time could not be changed. The ironclad historical anchors that had been accepted as facts by their readership, regardless of whether these events actually occurred or not, remained stable throughout the centuries in which the biblical text developed. What changed is the interpretation both of these events, including the cause and factors that led to them, and of their results and their link to other events, which could also be interpreted as punishment or reward or a prize. That is, the biblical description includes the memory of events that happened and were seared into the public consciousness, some of which were preserved in ancient texts, in poetry and prayers, or in various historiographical descriptions. But these descriptions also include events whose history is dubious, unknown, and unclear. These type of events were also integrated into the public consciousness as a result of the activity of various writers throughout the generation. Thus, stories and events were added throughout the history, interpretations of the stories and events were given all the time, and the literary activity also included a study of these events and a shaping of their meaning, their results, and their connections to other events. In this respect, it is not history itself, but historical memory that is important. The reality and the historical accuracy of the memory is not important. Rather, the existence within historical memory is critical. The lives within the text and the existence in the historiography are crucial as they direct the interpretation and the study of the text and determine its connections and ties with other texts. In this way, the text keeps developing and the memory keeps growing as the contents of the text and the events described become the historical truth in the collective memory. what happened or didn't happen is much less important than the meaning of the text for readers of the author's generation. This meaning changes over the generations, is interpreted and studied all the time,